Good afternoon. I'm Merit Janow, Dean of the School of International and Public Affairs, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this Fireside Chat with Brad Smith, President of Microsoft. We're really honored that Brad is joining us today to speak about his remarkable book, Tools and Weapons. I have right here, The Promise and Peril of the Digital Age, which he co-authored with Carol Ann Brown. Thank you, Brad, so much for being with us. And welcome back to SIPA and Columbia.
Thank you.
You joined us at our inaugural Global Digital Policy Forum in 2015, and we've continued every year since then. So it's particularly meaningful with so much has happened in the world to have you back. We don't have a lot of time, so I'll be very brief in my biographical introduction, but I think our large audience should well appreciate that Brad serves as president of Microsoft. He leads a team of more than 1,500 business, legal, and corporate professionals in some 54 countries, and he plays a crucial role in leading the company's work on the intersection of technology and society, whether it's cybersecurity or privacy or artificial intelligence, environmental stewardship, human rights, speech, immigration, philanthropy. Most of these areas he takes up in this book with vivid storytelling and consideration of the difficult trade-offs and associated ethical challenges. He joined Microsoft in '93, became general counsel in 2002, and I'm proud to say that Brad Smith and his remarkable wife are graduates of Columbia Law School, and we are all deeply appreciative of your ongoing involvement with Columbia University. Before starting our conversation, I'd like to take a moment to invite Alex Niejelow to say a few words of introduction about SIPA's Niejelow Rodin Global Digital Futures Forum. I'm very grateful to the Niejelow Rodin family for supporting and recognizing the value of SIPA's Tech and Policy Initiative, focused on the digital economy, cybersecurity, and digital governance. It reflects a cross-campus and expert collaboration with law, business, public policy, and engineering. Alex is himself a cybersecurity expert, a senior vice president for cyber coordination and advocacy at MasterCard, and earlier served in the White House. Alex, thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, Dean Janow. I will tell you, I was actually at the first inaugural Digital Futures Forum where Brad spoke. It only took us 7 years to actually fund it ourselves, but it was so convincing and compelling that we obviously decided to carry forward, and incredibly thrilled about that. I've had the pleasure of spending time with and working with Brad on a variety of issues ranging from national security to the future of work, on over to how we build a more secure, resilient, and inclusive digital economy in cyberspace. And I couldn't think of an individual that more perfectly personifies the intent of the Tech Policy Initiative and the Niejelow Rodin Digital Futures Forum. And with that, bring it back to you guys for the actual fireside chat.
Thank you very much. Great to have you with us, Alex, and thank you again. So, you know, when you were last with us, Brad, we were talking about privacy and security, but the Cloud Act, you know, hadn't been passed, nor GDPR. Data localization was a theme, but not widespread in the world. Internet fragmentation and governance, we were beginning to be concerned about. China tensions were escalating, but were far less than they are today. We were beginning to talk about platforms and speech and AI ethical issues. These are all things you touched on in your book. I hope we can try and cover a range. Your book was not yet out, but if I may, I'd like to start with a very general question, which is, as a leader at Microsoft and in this book, how do you identify and define the policy issues around which you personally and you want the company to have a public voice?
Well, first, let me say thank you for having me, and it's great to be here with Alex as well. And it is a question that we often have to ask ourselves. And I think what we try to do is speak out on issues where we feel we have some knowledge. I think that is sort of a prerequisite. And then some reason to have some credibility. And I think these largely relate to issues where there is an impact on our customers. I really feel in the world today, when customers are storing their data in our cloud, that gives us a responsibility to especially protect the security, the privacy, the safety of them and their data. And we therefore speak out on those issues. We definitely speak out on issues that have an impact on our employees. We speak out on certain issues that we think have an impact on the communities where we live and work. And that takes us to things like broadband and skilling. We feel that a healthy business needs a healthy community. And sometimes I find that people are surprised that it's taken me this long to mention the word shareholder. But the truth is, if we do a good job of taking care of our customers, our employees, and the communities in which we live and work, our shareholders, in my view, will always benefit.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That's a very helpful framing. And I think a question corporate leaders are asking themselves intensively in the current environment and going forward. Let me take you into the privacy and security issues that you engage so fully in this book. You have a section called Privacy as a Fundamental Human Right. And I think, this is reminiscent of EU language, the Charter of Fundamental Rights and also GDPR. And you talk about how you are navigating the world, but also how you're trying to nudge policymakers in making the right choices and new choices in the US and in the world. So from your perspective, what are the biggest sources of concern around privacy that you're worried about, and the actions that you think need to be taken at home? Because clearly countries are making different choices. We're not going to have an EU framework. So as you think about privacy in particular, where are we headed at home and in the world?
Well, I have probably two principal concerns. One is I think technology in effect has put privacy at greater risk. That's been really the biggest change to, say, the protection of people's privacy in practical terms over the past decade. Just virtually everything we do or read or say or write, is captured in digital form, and it's stored and it can be accessed by others, either a government or a company or pursuant to some leak, the broader public, even though they shouldn't have it. And I think that really focuses the spotlight on many things, including technology protection for privacy, but also the law. And one of my ongoing concerns is that this is an area where the United States has just lagged behind. There are roughly 110 countries that have comprehensive national privacy laws, and yet the United States is not one of them. We're on the cusp of that changing in Congress. We saw California adopt a law just last month. Virginia adopted a law. I think we'll see Washington State adopt a law. And I think we need to see Congress adopt a law, both so that we have stronger protection in this country, but frankly, so the US government has the foundation it needs to be more influential globally. I don't think it can without a national law.
And could you say a bit more about what you think that national law should look like?
Well, we actually are fairly enthusiastic about the GDPR. I mean, it's designed for Europeans by Europeans, and it needs to be translated into American legal concepts. But that's not the hardest thing in the world to do. And fundamentally, it melds a couple of different things. One is a traditional approach that says that you can't use somebody's information if you're a company obtaining it unless you give them notice, unless you give them consent, unless you get consent, unless you have certain safeguards in place. But the other thing that it should do, that the GDPR really advanced, is that people then need to have the right to access their data. They need to go to a big company, whether it's Microsoft or MasterCard or JP Morgan Chase or you name it, and be able to say, hey, what data do you have about me? So I know what you have. And if it's wrong, you have the chance to correct it. Those are just examples of the kinds of rights that Europeans have added. And we as a company, in fact, after GDPR took effect, said we will apply this to all of our customers worldwide. And we have for almost 3 years now. And in doing so, we found that Americans take advantage of these rights even more frequently on a per capita basis than Europeans. And we found that we can implement this with our technology in a cost-effective way.
Well, thank you. When you then speak a little bit more, if you would, on this relationship between privacy and security. There are things that companies need to do to enhance the security environment. There are things that companies have to do to work more effectively with each other and with governments. What do you see as the fundamental building blocks that we still must develop to instill the kind of trust and confidence that both governments and companies are building towards a more secure digital future?
Well, I first think it's not bad to step back and reflect upon two aspects of the relationship between privacy and security. On the one hand, they often go together, hand in hand. You can't have privacy protection without security, because if you don't, then you're going to have hacks, you're going to have information leak, you're going to have data breaches. And at the same time, there is sometimes a tension, especially between protection of privacy and, say, national security, because governments are seeking information, typically on individuals, for a variety of law enforcement or national security purposes. So it gets complicated. Now, at one level, it requires what I would say a modern, always up-to-date information technology infrastructure. And a lot of the problems that we see, whether it relates to privacy or security, is when we see lapses. And we may come to that because I think that's part of what we've been seeing even in recent months. But at the same time, we're seeing real international tensions, and especially for an audience like this, I think the tensions deserve more focus. We saw the collapse really of a transatlantic framework last year when the European Court struck down the privacy shield that had been negotiated between the US and the EU in 2016. So we see a lot more uncertainty right now. We see more controversy in Europe. They don't want to see data moving from Europe to the United States, and yet transatlantic commerce depends on it. And I don't think that will be restored until there's a new arrangement put in place to really provide the kinds of safeguards in the United States that the European Court has said need to be there. You mentioned the Cloud Act that was passed in 2018. It created a legislative framework in the United States for international agreements between the US and other governments that would establish a process for when governments want to use search warrants, for example, to get data in another country. But the follow-up has been slow. And we have not yet seen, for example, an international agreement between the US and the EU, or the US and France or Germany or any of the EU member states. And so without more modernization of this international diplomatic and legal framework, we just see commerce being held back. We see technology being held back. I think we see confidence in privacy itself really undermined as a result.
I've often thought that it's very hard to create international frameworks when a domestic framework is in flux. And that's particularly true for big countries, And so here, as you say, we're just at the beginnings of creating, we have heterogeneous state policies and no national privacy. We have very heterogeneous approaches to these questions across countries. But business wants and needs interoperability. So where do we start in maintaining interoperability? Is that through trade agreements? Is it through soft frameworks? Is it norm building? You've been an advocate for norm building. Are these all just each go at their own speed, but push ahead wherever you can? How do you think about that complexity?
I think in part, it's a little bit of everything that you just said. But in part, I'd say there's something going on around the world that's very important. And I sometimes think that Americans are less aware of it than they should be, and less familiar with it than in other countries. I think what we're really seeing is a lot of informal consultation and collaboration as governments are adopting these domestic legislative frameworks or new laws. And yeah, there's almost an arc of democracy. And frankly, it often starts in Australia and New Zealand. They tend to be early adopters. They move faster than most other democratic countries. But India and Japan and Korea are very much part of this. Canada, the UK now is really obviously on its own. You have France and Germany, and then Italy and others that really influence Brussels. Brussels is moving very quickly. The thing to remember, I believe, is that the US typically these days is among the last to move. So I think we have this belief here that, oh, it all is going to turn on what happens in Washington, DC. And yet I increasingly find by the time people in Washington, DC make a decision, the norms have really, increasingly been set. And the world has snapped to a different pattern, especially when you have technology that fundamentally is global in nature. And that's why I actually think that if we want the United States government to be more influential internationally, it goes back to the point you made. It also needs to move faster domestically. And often that really requires action in Congress, which we all know is difficult.
Yeah, very difficult. Well, thank you. Thank you for painting that global landscape. There's a view I'm hearing a lot these days that the US should work more closely with its allies, particularly in dealing with some of the challenges posed by China. And in the China context, technology-related frictions, I think, have never been higher. And of course, that also includes digital technology and the capacity for AI and data-related things to have both civilians and military, consequences. How do you think we deal with China more on these issues? Have we got the right frameworks right now? We're kind of, I think we're being very inclusive. There's a stepped up restrictions on investment, on all sorts of things, including even students studying technical subjects. So this is a big country and a big economy, and I'm wondering how we navigate the future with China around technology.
I think the view in Washington, DC on a bipartisan basis is that China is a competitor and a rival.
Yeah.
And I think it's fair to say that the view in Beijing of the United States is similar. Now, this is a different rivalry from what the United States faced in, say, the Cold War with the Soviet Union because of China's size, its economic prowess, frankly, its intellectual and engineering and economic base. So I think the first thing that we have to recognize in the United States is if we want to remain a leader, we're going to have to work harder and move faster. And that means we're going to have to continue to invest even more in what I'll call the intellectual and technology frontier. And with that, a lot of that happens at Columbia and the other research universities in the United States. It frankly means more funding and more work in fields like computer science, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the life sciences, and the like. It means continuing to invest in the education of a skilled workforce, not just those getting a 4-year or graduate degree, but really throughout our workforce. And it means, frankly, I think ensuring that the entire population has more access, not just to skills, but to technology itself, including broadband. If we don't do a great job in that area, I don't think anything else will make up for it. Yeah. At the same time, I do think that needs to be coupled with trade rules, and you're seeing a lot of trade policy and investment policy change to restrict or manage what leaves the United States and goes to China, or what comes from China and into the United States. And I just think we're going to see a lot more regulatory change in that space really over the next 24 months.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really have to say I agree with you profoundly. And maybe this is a moment, if we're going to spend $3 trillion around infrastructure, R&D, and so forth, we could ask ourselves those questions in a fresh way. I certainly hope so. But let me get to this regulatory issue you've raised, you also take up in your book the issues around social media tools and their impact on democracy, and the particular challenge of disinformation. And I must say, you've been applauded recently by many journalists for focusing on the decline of news organizations as a problem, and the role of ad tech platforms that they play in that deterioration. And this had very sharp focus recently on this Australian legislation. Could you speak, I know you've testified on this, could you speak to both your position and why you chose to speak up about that legislation?
Absolutely. We've been, focused on social media for some time, and it was well publicized last year that we entered into negotiations to purchase the US and some other national businesses of TikTok. So we focused even more thinking at that time. I think social media is like a lot of technology, and it's reflected in the title of our book. It's a tool and it's a weapon. And it's done good things and also created new challenges. One of the real challenges I think it has created is an unintended consequence, if you will, but it really has been part of the collapse of advertising revenue for traditional journalism and news organizations. And I think especially as we look at what led up to, say, the events of January 6th of this year in the Capitol, it was both the rise of misinformation, disinformation, if you will, in many instances sort of fomented through social media. And at the same time, I think we really missed that traditional foundation that we've long had of local news and healthy journalism more broadly, that gives us a common understanding of at least the issues of the day, even if we might have different opinions. And so basically what happened in Australia was they were considering a law they've now passed, that would require that big tech platforms share certain amounts of revenue with news organizations on what struck us as a fair basis, backed up with fair arbitration and the ability of news organizations to negotiate collectively. Google said that if it was passed, they would leave the country and their search business would be pulled out. Well, we have a search business in Australia, Bing, and we looked at that and said, well, we're okay with this law. And so we reached out to Prime Minister Scott Morrison and said, look, if Google leaves, we'll stay. And we then went forward publicly and said the same thing. I said the same thing. And I think that actually had an impact. Google, within 24 hours, said, never mind, we're going to stay after all. There were some modest amendments to the legislation before it was passed. But I think it has sparked a global debate, a necessary global debate, about the relationship between technology and journalism and news, and new steps that I think should be taken to correct this economic imbalance. And there's legislation in our own Congress now to consider doing that as well.
So, I mean, this one of the, I think, debates we're seeing in America and all over the world is about tools, and harms and outcomes. So do you see this as a competition issue, a speech issue? I'm wondering whether we have the right tools to deal with these challenges.
Well, what I find fascinating, and people at Columbia Law School have been at the real intellectual forefront of this issue over the last few years. The United States really founded antitrust law, and that was in the late 1800s. It was in response fundamentally to the rise of Standard Oil and U.S. Steel and these other giants of that time. And it was all about legal tools to protect economic markets.
Yes.
And I think that the issues of today still involve the vitality of economic markets, but we are dealing as well with an era of technology where there's not only an impact on the economy, but on democracy itself. And so I think one of the questions, which I believe is entirely appropriate, is to ask, well, if we can use these tools to protect the economy, shouldn't we also consider using them to protect democracy? I believe the answer, quite rightly, is yes. And we may not necessarily want to use lawsuits and the like. It may be new laws and regulations, which we've also used to regulate markets before. One thing I think is happening when you really step back is I think the 2020s are going to do for digital services what the 1930s did for financial services. The 1930s remade the regulation of financial services, and they went from largely being unregulated to operating in the context of markets that were governed by new laws and new rules. And it's odd to hear somebody from an industry that will be regulated say, well, maybe that's not such a bad thing, but I will say, maybe that's not such a bad thing. Maybe the key for healthy markets in the long term, and more important than that, maybe what is fundamental for the preservation of democracy is some more rules than we've had over the last few decades.
Well, it's very, very powerful point. I hope we can reach enough of a consensus at home to fashion remedies and approaches that have some widespread support. I have a feeling we need a sequel already, Brad. Are you thinking about that?
Well, we do actually, at least not a sequel, but we have a revised and updated edition coming out this September with 3 new chapters and a lot of change that we've written because things have been moving so fast. So it's one of the great things about a book, as you know, is it forces you to decide what you think. And there's nothing like really forcing you to figure out what you think, like having to write it all down. And so that's how the holiday season in COVID in 2020 was spent. But I'm glad we spent the time on it.
Well, I think we're all glad you spent the time on it. Thank you so much for being with us today. It's great to have you back. Hope you'll join us again, and bravo for all you're doing. Thank you so much.
Well, and thank you. Good to be with all of you.
Good to be with you. Thank you.